Most philosophers came from wealth, from privilege, from aristocratic families with libraries and leisure time. Epictetus had none of that. He was born a slave, around 50 AD, in Hierapolis, modern-day Turkey. His very name wasn't even a real name. Epictetus roughly translates to acquired. That's what he was to the world, property, a thing to be owned. And at some point, whether through his master's cruelty or illness, his leg was permanently crippled. So here's a man who couldn't even walk freely, let alone live freely. No rights, no autonomy, no say over his own body. But here's what makes his story remarkable. Not that he escaped slavery, though he eventually did. Not that he overcame a physical disability, though he carried that his whole life. What makes Epictetus extraordinary is what he built from that suffering. A philosophy so sharp, so grounded, so ruthlessly practical that it outlived the Roman Empire itself. He studied under Musonius Rufus, one of the great Stoic teachers of the time. And after gaining his freedom, he didn't chase wealth or status. He opened a school. He taught. He spent the rest of his life helping others see what he had seen from the bottom. That freedom isn't something the world gives you. It's something you build inside yourself. Now, Epictetus never wrote a single word down. Everything we have comes from his student Arrian, who recorded his lectures in 2 works, the Discourses and the Enchiridion. And yet those records contain some of the most penetrating insights into human nature ever captured. This isn't dusty academic philosophy. Epictetus wasn't theorizing from a comfortable chair. He forged his ideas in real pain, real bondage, real limitation. And that's exactly why they hit different. So what we're going to do here is break down his philosophy, concept by concept. Not to admire it from a distance, but to understand what he actually taught, what he actually meant, and why nearly 2,000 years later, it still cuts deep. Epictetus opens the Enchiridion with what might be the most important line in all of Stoic philosophy, and he doesn't ease into it. He doesn't warm you up, he just says it. Some things are within our power, while others are not. That's it. That's the foundation. Everything else he teaches, every lesson, every warning, every piece of guidance, sits on top of this single distinction. He divides all of human experience into 2 clean categories. On one side, your judgments, your desires, your impulses, your will. These are yours, fully yours. On the other side, your body, your reputation, your property, your position in life. These, not yours, not really. And here's where Epictetus gets sharp. He doesn't say the things outside your control are unimportant. He says they are not yours. There's a difference, a big one. You can value your health, you can prefer wealth, but the moment you treat them as things you command, that's when suffering begins. He argues that most human misery comes from one mistake, just one. People pour their energy into things they cannot control. They obsess over outcomes. They try to force other people to behave a certain way. They rage against events that have already happened. And then they wonder why they're anxious, why they're frustrated, why peace feels so far away. Epictetus says the answer is not more effort, it's better aim. Direct your will toward what actually responds to your will. That's it. But, and this is where a lot of people misread him, he's not preaching passivity. He's not saying sit back and let life happen to you. He's saying act with full force, full intention, full commitment, but attach yourself to the effort, not the result. You can train for the race, you can't guarantee the win. You can speak the truth, you can't control whether people listen. He warns that confusing these 2 categories doesn't just lead to frustration, it leads to enslavement. His word, not mine. When you hinge your peace on something outside your authority, a promotion, someone's approval, a specific outcome, you hand the keys to your inner life over to something you were never meant to drive. And he speaks from experience. Epictetus was born a slave, literal chains. So when he talks about freedom and control, he's not being abstract. He's lived the most extreme version of having no external control. And yet, he points out, even in chains, your mind is yours, your responses are yours, your character is yours. That's why this concept hits so hard. It's not theory, it's forged from real life. He also makes a subtle but critical point that often gets overlooked. He says, when you stick to what's within your control, no one can coerce you, no one can restrain you. You won't blame anyone, you won't accuse anyone, you won't act against your own will. No one will harm you, because harm, real harm, only happens when you let external things dictate your internal state. So the dichotomy of control isn't just a philosophical concept for Epictetus, it's the operating system. Everything else he teaches runs on it. His views on desire, on emotion, on relationships, on loss, all of it traces back to this one question. Is this within my control or isn't it? And he urges you to ask that question constantly. Not once, not when things go wrong, every single day, every reaction, every impulse. Because the moment you stop asking it, you're back in chains. Epictetus has this idea that cuts right to the bone. He says, life is like a play, and you're an actor. But here's the thing, you didn't write the script, you didn't pick the role, you didn't choose whether you'd be rich or poor, healthy or sick, powerful or forgotten. That was handed to you. And Epictetus says, that's fine, that's not the point. The point is how you play the role you've been given. He's pulling from a metaphor that would have hit hard in ancient Rome. Theater was everywhere. Everyone understood what it meant to step on stage and perform. So when Epictetus compares life to a play, he's not being poetic for the sake of it. He's making a structural argument about the nature of human existence. You don't control the casting, you don't control the plot, but you absolutely control your performance. And this is where he draws a sharp line. Most people spend their entire lives frustrated because they wanted a different role. They wanted to be born somewhere else, to someone else, with something else. They look at what they were given and reject it. They argue with reality. Epictetus says that's the fastest way to ruin your life. He argues that the quality of a person is not revealed by the role they play, but by how they play it. A person cast as a beggar who plays that role with dignity, with patience, with wisdom, that person is living well. A person cast as a king who plays that role with cruelty, with arrogance, with cowardice, that person is failing. The role doesn't matter, the performance does. And he pushes this even further. He warns that wanting a different role is not just unwise, it's a form of madness, because you're fighting against something you cannot change. You're spending energy on a battle you've already lost before it started. The role is set. It's done. The only question left is, what are you going to do with it? So, what does playing your role well actually look like? Epictetus breaks it down simply. It means accepting your circumstances without bitterness. It means acting with virtue, regardless of what's happening around you. It means not confusing your external situation with your internal character. He points out that a short role played brilliantly is worth more than a long role played poorly. Life might be brief. Your time in a particular situation might be short. None of that matters. What matters is whether you brought excellence to the moment you were in. And there's something deeply freeing in this idea. Because if the role isn't yours to choose, then there's no reason to feel shame about it, no reason to feel envy. No reason to compare yourself to the person next to you who was handed a completely different script. Your job isn't to have their role. Your job is to master yours. Epictetus is essentially removing every excuse a person could ever have. You can't say, "I would have been great if only I'd been given more." He doesn't accept that. He says greatness is available in every role, every single one. The slave can be great. The emperor can be a failure. It's not about position. It's about character. And that reframe, that hard, unflinching reframe, is one of the most powerful ideas in all of Stoic philosophy, because it takes the focus off everything external and drives it inward, right where Epictetus believes it belongs. You were given a role. You didn't choose it. Now play it like it matters, because according to Epictetus, that's the only thing that actually does. Epictetus talks about something that most people never build, and it costs nothing, takes up no space, can't be stolen, burned, or taxed. He calls it the inner citadel, a fortress inside you, a place where your mind, your judgments, your character, all of it stays untouchable, no matter what's happening on the outside. And here's what makes this idea so sharp. Epictetus doesn't say, try to feel safe. He doesn't say, think positive. He says, build something, deliberately, brick by brick, a structure inside yourself that no external force can breach. See, most people live with their doors wide open. Their peace depends on whether the boss is happy, whether the relationship is smooth, whether the news is good. One bad phone call and the whole thing collapses. Epictetus looks at that and says, that's not a life, that's a hostage situation. He argues that the inner citadel is built through discipline of thought, not emotion, thought. Because for Epictetus, your judgments are the walls, your principles are the foundation, and your refusal to hand over your mental sovereignty to anything external, that's the gate, locked, from the inside. Now, what does this actually look like? Epictetus points out that when someone insults you, they haven't breached the citadel. They've thrown a rock at the wall. Whether it gets in, that's your choice. If you react, if you spiral, if you let that insult define your mood for the rest of the day, you opened the gate yourself. Nobody forced their way in. You invited them. And he's relentless about this. He warns that people will try to provoke you. Life will try to destabilize you. Illness, loss, betrayal, these things will come. That's not the question. The question is, when they arrive, do they find a fortress or a tent? He draws a hard line here. The citadel isn't about suppressing emotion. It's not about being cold or detached. Epictetus makes that distinction clearly. It's about choosing which emotions get to stay, which thoughts get residency. You don't just let anything walk through the front door of your mind. You examine it, you question it, and if it doesn't serve your character, you turn it away. This is where Epictetus separates himself from the noise. He's not offering comfort, he's offering architecture, a blueprint for psychological resilience that doesn't depend on anything outside of you. Not money, not status, not even health, because he himself had none of those securities, and yet his citadel held. He also makes a point that's easy to miss. The citadel isn't built once, it's maintained daily. Every morning you wake up and decide, am I going to protect this space, or am I going to let the world flood in? Every interaction is a test. Every setback is a siege. And every time you hold your ground, the walls get stronger. But every time you hand your peace over to something you can't control, the walls crack. And Epictetus warns, cracks left unrepaired become collapses. So what he's really saying is this: you don't need the world to be calm in order to be calm. You don't need people to be kind in order to be steady. You don't need circumstances to cooperate in order to stand firm. You just need the Citadel. And the Citadel is yours to build, right now. Not when life gets easier, not when you have more time. Now. Epictetus doesn't promise that the storms will stop. He promises that if you build right, they won't matter. That's the fortress no one can touch. Epictetus breaks human psychology down to two fundamental drives: desire and aversion. That's it. Every decision you've ever made, every emotional reaction, every moment of suffering or satisfaction, he traces it back to one of these two forces. You either want something or you're trying to avoid something. And according to Epictetus, most people get both of these catastrophically wrong. Here's how he frames it. Desire is the movement towards something. You reach for it, you chase it, you crave it. Aversion is the movement away. You dodge it, you resist it, you dread it. Simple enough on the surface. But Epictetus argues that the entire quality of your life depends on where you point these two drives. And here's where most people fall apart. They desire things they can't control: health, wealth, reputation, other people's approval. They build their entire inner world around acquiring things that were never guaranteed to them. And when those things don't arrive, or worse, when they arrive and then disappear, the person breaks. Not because the thing was lost, but because the desire was misplaced from the start. Epictetus is brutally clear on this. He warns that when you desire what is not in your power, you are setting yourself up for disappointment. Not might, will. It's not a risk, it's a guarantee. You will be frustrated. You will be disturbed because you've handed your inner stability over to something that doesn't answer to you. The same applies to aversion. Most people are averse to things like illness, poverty, death, rejection. And Epictetus doesn't say those things are pleasant. He's not delusional. But he points out that being averse to things outside your control traps you in a permanent state of anxiety. You're constantly bracing for impact, constantly scanning the horizon for threats you can't actually prevent. That's not living. That's surviving, barely. So what does he propose? A complete redirection. Epictetus argues that desire should be aimed only at what is within your control: your judgments, your choices, your character. And aversion should be reserved only for what is truly harmful, in the Stoic sense: vice, poor reasoning, moral failure. Not external events, not circumstances, your own corruption. That's what you should be running from. And he goes even further. For beginners, people just starting to practice, he actually recommends suspending desire altogether. Just set it down. Don't chase anything for now. Focus entirely on training your aversion first. Get rid of the fear of things you can't control. Strip that away. Once you've done that, then and only then are you ready to desire properly. This is the foundation of what scholars call his discipline of desire. It's the first of 3 areas of training Epictetus lays out, and he insists it comes first for a reason. Because if your desires and aversions are misaligned, nothing else works. Your logic doesn't matter. Your ethics don't hold. Everything downstream gets poisoned. He compares it to a person who's thirsty and drinks from a contaminated well. The thirst is real, the need is real, but the source is wrong. And so the very thing meant to sustain you destroys you. That's what misplaced desire does. That's what unchecked aversion does. Epictetus doesn't ask people to stop wanting. He doesn't ask them to become numb. He asks them to want the right things and to fear only what actually deserves their fear. The shift sounds small, but he treats it as the single most important reorientation a human being can make. Get this wrong, and philosophy is just noise. Get this right, and everything else begins to fall into place. This one makes people uncomfortable, and honestly, it should. Epictetus didn't just acknowledge death, he insisted you think about it, regularly, deliberately, not in some morbid, dark way, but as a practice, a discipline, something you do the way you brush your teeth in the morning. He tells his students, when you kiss your child goodnight, remind yourself, this child is mortal. When you embrace someone you love, whisper to yourself that they could be gone tomorrow. That sounds brutal, almost cruel. But Epictetus isn't being cruel. He's being honest. See, for him, the problem isn't death itself. The problem is the shock of it. The way it catches people off guard and destroys them. Not because the loss is unbearable, but because they never once considered it was possible. They lived in a fantasy where the people they love, the life they have, would just continue indefinitely. And when reality breaks through that fantasy, it breaks them too. So Epictetus argues that rehearsing death, what the Stoics called premeditatio mortis, isn't pessimism, it's preparation. And there's a massive difference between the two. A pessimist says everything will go wrong. Epictetus says everything can go wrong, and you need to be ready for that. One drains you, the other strengthens you. And he's very specific about how this works. He doesn't want you spiraling into anxiety about the future. That's not what this is. He wants you to sit with the reality of impermanence, calmly, clearly, so that when loss arrives, it doesn't shatter your mind. You've already seen it coming, not because you predicted it, but because you understood the nature of things. He points out something most people never stop to consider. Everything you have, your health, your relationships, your status, your body, all of it is borrowed. None of it was ever guaranteed to stay. And the moment you start treating borrowed things as permanent possessions, that's the moment you set yourself up for devastation. Death, for Epictetus, is the ultimate reminder of that truth. It's not a punishment, it's not a tragedy, it's the natural order. He argues that fearing death is essentially fearing reality itself, and anyone who fears reality has already lost control of their inner life. But here's what's really interesting. This practice isn't just about death, it's about living. Epictetus suggests that when you genuinely internalize the fact that this moment, right now, could be your last with someone, you stop taking it for granted. You stop arguing about nonsense. You stop holding grudges over things that won't matter in a week. The awareness of death doesn't make life darker. It makes it sharper, more vivid, more intentional. He warns against the opposite too. People who refuse to think about death, they're the ones who waste time. They postpone. They assume there's always tomorrow. And then, one day, there isn't. And they're left with nothing but regret and the hollow realization that they spent their entire life asleep. Epictetus doesn't want that for anyone. That's why the rehearsal matters. Not once, not occasionally, daily. He treats it like mental conditioning. The same way an athlete trains the body, you train the mind to accept what's coming, so that when it comes, you're not destroyed by it. You're ready. And readiness, for Epictetus, isn't about being cold or emotionless. It's about being free. Free from the grip of illusion, free from the tyranny of false expectations, free to actually live, fully, presently, because you've already made peace with the one thing everyone else is running from. Here's something that should stop you in your tracks. One of the most powerful philosophies ever put into words, a philosophy that Roman emperors studied, that generals carried into battle, that shaped Western thought for 2,000 years, came from a man who was born with nothing, less than nothing. He was property. Epictetus was born a slave, around 50 AD, in Hierapolis, modern-day Turkey. He didn't choose his life. He didn't choose his master. He didn't even have the right to his own body. And yet, this is the man who would go on to teach some of the most elite minds in the Roman Empire how to think, how to endure, how to be free. And not free in some abstract poetic sense. Genuinely free, internally unshakable. His master was Epictetus, a wealthy, powerful freedman who served under Emperor Nero. And according to some ancient sources, Epictetus was brutal. There's a well-known account, its historical accuracy debated, but telling nonetheless, that Epictetus once twisted Epictetus's leg deliberately, and Epictetus calmly reportedly said, "You're going to break it." And when the leg snapped, he simply added, "I told you so." No screaming, no begging, just stillness. Now, whether that story is literally true or not, it tells us something critical about how the ancient world understood this man. He was not performing toughness. He had arrived at a place mentally where external pain could not own him. And that distinction between what happens to you and what happens in you became the foundation of everything he taught. At some point, Epictetus was allowed to study under Musonius Rufus, one of the foremost Stoic teachers in Rome, and this is where the shift began. Stoic philosophy didn't just interest Epictetus, it restructured him from the inside out. He absorbed it, he lived it, and eventually, after gaining his freedom, likely after Nero's death in 68 AD, he began to teach it himself. But here's the thing, he didn't write anything down, not a single word. Everything we have from Epictetus comes through his student, Arrian, who attended his lectures and recorded them. What survived are two works, the Discourses, a collection of his teachings and classroom conversations, and the Enchiridion, a short manual, a distilled handbook of his core ideas. And those texts hit different. They're not gentle, they don't coddle. Epictetus speaks like a man who earned every word through suffering. There's an urgency to his philosophy that you don't find in most ancient thinkers. He's not theorizing about the good life from a comfortable villa. He's forging principles in fire. He eventually set up his school in Nicopolis in northwestern Greece after Emperor Domitian banished philosophers from Rome. And even in exile, his reputation grew. Students traveled long distances to sit in his classroom. His influence reached all the way to Marcus Aurelius, who quoted and referenced Epictetus extensively in his Meditations, a private journal written by the most powerful man in the world. So pause on that for a second. A slave's words, guiding an emperor's inner life. That's not a footnote. That is the whole point. Epictetus didn't build his philosophy from privilege. He built it from constraint, from pain, from powerlessness. And that's exactly why it cuts so deep, because he wasn't asking questions like, what is the good life, from a place of comfort. He was asking them from the bottom, from a place where the only freedom available was the freedom inside his own mind, and he seized it completely. Most people spend their entire lives terrified of three things: getting sick, losing everything, dying. Epictetus looked at all three and was unmoved. Not because he was numb, not because he didn't understand suffering. The man was a crippled former slave. He understood suffering better than most philosophers ever could. But he arrived at something that changed the way he saw every threat the world could throw at him. And it starts with one distinction, maybe the most important distinction in the entire history of philosophy. Epictetus divides all of existence into two categories, things that are up to us and things that are not. He calls this the fundamental starting point of wisdom, and he means it. In the Encheirodon, he opens with this idea, not halfway through, not buried in a chapter, right at the beginning, because everything else he teaches flows from this single insight. So, what's up to us? Our judgments, our desires, our intentions, our responses. That's it. That's the list. And what's not up to us? Our bodies, our reputations, our possessions, other people's actions, the weather, the economy, whether we live or die tomorrow. Now, here's where Epictetus gets sharp. He argues that all human misery, all of it, comes from one mistake: treating things that are not up to us as though they are. You're anxious because you're trying to control an outcome you were never in charge of. You're angry because someone acted in a way you couldn't dictate. You're devastated because something was taken from you, something that, in Epictetus's view, was never really yours to begin with. He puts it bluntly: sickness affects the body.
But does it have to affect the will? Only if you let it. Exile removes you from a place, but does it remove your capacity to think clearly, to act with integrity? No. Death ends your life. But Epictetus asks, was your life ever guaranteed? Was it ever something you owned? This is why he could look at these things without flinching. He wasn't pretending they didn't matter.
He was pointing out that they don't have the power people think they do. The power was never in the event. It was always in the interpretation. And that word, interpretation, is everything in Epictetus' system. He argues that it's not things that disturb us, but our judgments about things. A sentence so loaded it could take a lifetime to fully absorb. Someone insults you. The insult didn't hurt you. Your belief that you were diminished by it, that's what hurt you. You lose your job. The loss didn't crush you. Your assumption that your worth was tied to it, that crushed you. Epictetus keeps driving this home over and over because he knows how deep the habit runs. Humans reflexively assign power to external events. They hand over their peace to circumstances, to other people, to things completely outside their control. And then they wonder why they're miserable. He warns against this with real urgency, not as a gentle suggestion, as a demand. Stop reaching for what isn't yours to hold. Stop grieving over what was never in your hands. The moment you internalize this, truly internalize it, sickness becomes a fact, not a tragedy. Exile becomes a change of scenery, not a punishment. Death becomes a natural conclusion, not a horror. That's why Epictetus could laugh, not out of arrogance, not out of denial, but out of a deep, hard-won clarity about where his power actually lived and where it didn't. If the dichotomy of control is the foundation, then the three disciplines are the structure Epictetus builds on top of it. These aren't abstract categories he invented for the sake of philosophy. These are practices, daily, relentless, non-negotiable practices. He calls them the three areas of training: the discipline of desire, the discipline of action, and the discipline of assent. Each one targets a different part of how you move through life. And Epictetus is clear: you don't get to skip any of them. You don't get to master one and ignore the rest. They work together. Drop one and the whole thing falls apart. So let's break them down. The discipline of desire is where it all starts. Epictetus argues that most people desire the wrong things, or more accurately, they desire things that aren't up to them. They want wealth, they want praise, they want the world to bend in their direction, and when it doesn't, they break. He says the fix is radical. Train your desire to only reach for what's within your control, and train your aversion to only pull away from what's truly harmful, which in his framework means poor judgments and bad character. Not pain, not poverty, not death. Those aren't in your hands, so wanting to avoid them at all costs is a trap. This is the hardest discipline, and Epictetus knows it. He even suggests beginners start here. Strip away misplaced desires before doing anything else. Because if your wants are aimed at the wrong targets, nothing else you do will land right. The discipline of action comes next. This one's about how you engage with other people and the world around you. Epictetus points out that you don't live in isolation. You have roles: son, daughter, friend, citizen, neighbor. And each role carries duties. He argues that action should be appropriate, deliberate, and rooted in service to the common good, not selfish, not reactive, not driven by ego. You act because the situation calls for it, not because you're chasing a reward. But here's the key distinction he makes. You act with a reserve clause. You do your part fully, completely, with everything you've got, but you hold the outcome loosely. I will do this, fate permitting. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. It means your sense of purpose doesn't collapse the moment things don't go your way. And then there's the discipline of assent. This is the most internal of the three. It's about what happens in that split second between an event and your reaction to it. Epictetus calls the raw data of experience an impression. Something happens, your mind presents it to you in a certain light, and in that moment, right there, you either accept the impression as true, reject it, or withhold judgment. He warns that most people never pause. They take every impression at face value. Someone insults you, and instantly your mind says, "I've been wronged." But Epictetus pushes back. He says, wait, test it. Is this impression accurate? Or is your mind adding a story that doesn't belong? This discipline is where real freedom lives, according to Epictetus. Because if you can catch a false impression before it takes root, you've stopped suffering at the source, not after the fact, not through damage control, at the source.
3 disciplines: desire, action, assent. Epictetus doesn't present them as ideas to think about. He presents them as skills to train, every single day. The way an athlete trains the body, he says you must train the mind. No days off.
Someone calls you a fool. Someone mocks your work. Someone dismisses everything you stand for in front of a room full of people. What do? Most people react. They fire back, they seethe. They replay the moment over and over, crafting the perfect response hours too late. The insult gets inside them and stays there, rotting. Epictetus says none of that has to happen, not because you should pretend it didn't hurt, but because if you understand what's actually going on, it can't hurt. Not really. Here's his argument, and it's ruthlessly simple. He says it's never the insult that disturbs you, it's your judgment about the insult. Someone calls you stupid, that's just words, sound waves, air moving. The pain doesn't come from what they said, it comes from what you decided it meant. You took those words, ran them through your own beliefs, your own insecurities, your own need for approval, and you created the suffering, not them, you. Epictetus makes this point bluntly. He argues that no one can insult you without your permission, and he means that literally. The power of an insult lives entirely inside the person receiving it. If you don't grant it power, it has none. It just falls to the ground, dead on arrival. And he's not being naive here. He's not saying just ignore it the way someone dismissive would. He's making a deeper claim. He's saying that the moment you feel stung by an insult, that sting is information, not about the other person, but about you. It reveals where you're still dependent on external approval, where you've handed control of your inner life to someone else's mouth. That's the real problem, not the insult, the dependency.
He warns against retaliation too, not on moral grounds, though that's part of it, but on practical grounds. When you retaliate, you confirm that the insult landed. You show the other person, and yourself, that they got in. They reached you. They moved you. And now you're dancing to their rhythm. You've given up your position.
Epictetus says the wise person doesn't do that. The wise person hears the insult, examines it briefly, and asks one question: is it true? If it's true, then there's nothing to be upset about. It's just a fact. Someone pointed out a flaw. Good, now you know. And if it's not true, then it's irrelevant. It says nothing about you. It says everything about them. Either way, the reaction is the same: stillness. He also points out something most people miss. The person throwing the insult is often acting out of ignorance. They don't see clearly. They're driven by their own passions, their own frustrations, their own lack of training. Getting angry at them, Epictetus argues, is like getting angry at a blind person for stepping on your foot. They don't know what they're doing, and your anger won't give them sight. So what does he recommend? Pause. That's it. Before the heat rises, before the jaw tightens, before the words fly out, pause. Examine the impression. Ask yourself what's really happening, and choose your response from a place of clarity, not reflex. Because that's the whole game for Epictetus. The space between what happens and how you respond. That's where your freedom lives. An insult is just a test of that space, a chance to prove not to anyone else but to yourself that you are not a puppet, that your strings aren't that easy to pull. And when you get there, when someone insults you and you genuinely feel nothing, Epictetus says that's not coldness, that's strength. Epictetus was a slave, literally, owned by another man, beaten, controlled. He knew what chains felt like, the real kind. So when he talks about slavery, he's not being metaphorical for dramatic effect. He's speaking from a place most philosophers never could, and what he says is unsettling. He argues that most free people who walk around unchained, with rights, with choices, with money in their pockets, are still slaves, completely, totally, and they don't even know it. That's the part that stings. Because Epictetus doesn't define slavery the way most people do. He doesn't define it by legal status or social position. He defines it by one thing: dependence. If your inner state depends on something outside your control, you are not free. You are owned. You just can't see the chain. And he gets specific. He points out the man who's desperate for approval. That man is a slave to opinion. The woman who can't bear losing her wealth, she's a slave to fortune. The person who rearranges their entire life to avoid discomfort, slave to pleasure. The one who sieves at every slight, slave to anger. Epictetus isn't gentle about this. He warns that these invisible chains are worse than iron ones. Why? Because at least a man in physical chains knows he's bound. He can dream of freedom. He can work toward it. But someone enslaved internally, they think they're already free. And that delusion, that's the trap. He makes this argument again and again in the discourses. Freedom isn't about what you can do, it's about what you don't need. The person who needs nothing from the outside world, that. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Epictetus holds up a mirror and asks, what are you afraid of losing? Your reputation? Your comfort? Someone's love? Whatever that thing is, that's your master. That's the thing pulling your strings. You move when it moves. You panic when it's threatened. You obey it without even being asked. He calls this out not to shame anyone. He calls it out because he believes recognition is the first step. You can't break a chain you refuse to see. And most people refuse to see it because admitting you're enslaved,
when you think you're free, is one of the hardest things a person can do. But Epictetus also makes a crucial distinction. He's not saying desire is wrong. He's not saying you shouldn't care about anything. He's saying know the difference between preference and dependence. You can prefer health without being enslaved to it. You can enjoy wealth without being owned by it. The moment your peace collapses because that thing is taken away, you've crossed the line. You're no longer preferring, you're serving. And the remedy he offers isn't abstract, it's precise. Train your will, strengthen your judgments. Practice wanting only what is within your power, your choices, your character, your responses. Stop wanting what isn't, other people's behavior, outcomes, circumstances. That's the path out. Epictetus argues that true freedom is the most internal thing there is. It doesn't require permission. It doesn't require resources. It requires one decision: to stop handing yourself over to things that were never yours to begin with. He walked out of literal slavery and built a philosophy of liberation from the inside out. And his challenge to everyone who reads him is simple. You were never chained by the world. You chained yourself, and only you hold the key. One of the most striking images Epictetus offers is deceptively simple. He compares life to a banquet, a dinner table, dishes being passed around from person to person. And in that one metaphor, he lays out an entire philosophy of how to move through the world. Here's how it works. You're seated at a table, a dish comes around to you. Take a moderate portion, don't pile your plate high, don't grab with both hands. Just take what's appropriate. And if the dish hasn't reached you yet, don't stretch across the table for it. Don't stare at it. Don't burn with impatience. Wait, it'll come, or it won't. Either way, your composure stays intact. And if it passes you by entirely, let it go. Don't reach after it. Don't complain that someone else got more. Don't make a scene. It passed. That's it. Now, replace the dishes with everything people chase in life: career, relationships, children, wealth, status, health. Epictetus argues that all of these are dishes being passed around a table you didn't set. You don't control when they arrive. You don't control when they leave. You don't control whether they come to you at all, but you do control how you respond when they do or don't. And this is where the metaphor gets its real teeth, because Epictetus isn't just talking about patience. He's talking about the posture of a person who understands their place, someone who recognizes that life doesn't owe them any particular dish, that nothing arriving at the table was custom-made for them. It's all passing through, all of it, temporary, on loan. He points out that most people treat life like a competition at the table, grabbing, hoarding, resenting what others received. And that desperate grasping, it doesn't just make them miserable, it makes them undignified. They lose something far more valuable than whatever they were reaching for. They lose their character. But then Epictetus pushes the metaphor one step further. And this is the part most people miss. He says, if you can learn not only to take moderately when a dish arrives, but to actually pass on it entirely, to not even need it, then you become something rare. You become, in his words, worthy to dine with the gods. Not because you've earned some mystical status, but because you've reached a place where external things no longer have a grip on you. You can sit at the table of life fully present, fully calm, needing nothing that's being served. That's freedom in Epictetus's framework. Not getting everything you want, but not needing any of it. And there's a quiet ruthlessness to this metaphor that's easy to overlook. He's not just advising moderation. He's describing detachment from outcomes. The dish is a metaphor for everything people tie their identity to. And he's saying,
none of it is yours. Not really, not permanently. So hold it lightly. Or better yet, learn to sit at the table with open hands. What makes this metaphor so accessible is how accessible it is. You don't need a background in philosophy to get it. Everyone's been at a table. Everyone knows the feeling of wanting more, of eyeing someone else's plate, of being disappointed when something runs out before it reaches you. Epictetus takes that universal, everyday experience and turns it into a mirror. He forces a question. How are you behaving at the banquet? Are you grateful for what comes? Are you at peace with what doesn't? Or are you lunging across the table, making yourself small over things that were never promised to you? The table is set. The dishes are moving. Epictetus says your only real choice is how you sit. Epictetus didn't have a soft view of hardship. He didn't try to sugarcoat it. He didn't say things will get better and leave it at that. What he said was far more demanding and far more useful. He argues that tough times aren't interruptions to life. They are life. The struggle, the pain, the setback, that's not some glitch in the system. That's the system working exactly as it's supposed to. And the sooner you accept that, the sooner you stop being crushed by things that were never in your control to begin with. This is where Epictetus draws a hard line. He separates everything, literally everything, into two categories: things within your control and things not. Your thoughts, your choices, your responses, those are yours. Everything else, the economy, other people's actions, illness, loss, none of that belongs to you. And he warns that the moment you start trying to control what isn't yours, you invite suffering into your life with both hands. So when hard times hit, and they will, Epictetus doesn't ask, why is this happening? He asks a different question entirely. What can I do with this? That shift matters. It's not just a change in words. It's a complete change in posture. One question makes you a victim. The other makes you a participant. He uses a powerful analogy. Life, he says, is like a wrestling match. You don't get to choose your opponent. You don't get to decide when you'll be thrown to the ground. But you do get to decide how you respond when it happens. Do you stay down, or do you get back on your feet and adjust your stance? The obstacle isn't the enemy. Your reaction to it is. And Epictetus goes even deeper than that. He argues that hardship is actually necessary, not just tolerable, necessary. Without resistance, there's no growth. Without difficulty, there's no strength. He points out that a wrestler who only trains against weak opponents never develops real skill. The tough opponent is the one who makes you better. So when life throws something brutal at you, Epictetus sees it as training, not punishment.
But, and this is important, he's not saying you should enjoy suffering. He's not romanticizing pain. What he's saying is that your judgment about the event is what causes the real damage. The event itself is neutral. It just is. You're the one who adds the label. This is terrible. This is unfair. This shouldn't be happening. Epictetus argues that those labels are the actual source of your misery.
Not the event, the story you tell yourself about it. He puts it bluntly. It's not things that disturb people. It's their judgments about things. Strip away the judgment, and what's left? Just a situation. Just something that happened. And something that happened can be dealt with. Something terrible and unfair that paralyzes you. So his advice during tough times is almost ruthlessly simple. Stop complaining. Stop wishing things were different. Look at what's in front of you. Ask yourself what's actually within your power right now, and act on that. Nothing more, nothing less. He warns that most people waste their suffering. They go through hell and come out the other side having learned nothing.
because they spent the entire time resisting what was happening instead of engaging with it. Epictetus doesn't want passive endurance. He wants active engagement. Meet the difficulty, work with it, let it shape you.
That's not optimism. That's not toughness for the sake of toughness. That's clarity. And for Epictetus, clarity in the middle of chaos, that's the real test of a trained mind.
If there's one idea Epictetus is known for, one concept that sits at the absolute center of everything he taught, it's this: the dichotomy of control. He opens the Enchiridion with it. Right there, line 1. No build-up, no preamble. He states it like a law of nature. Some things are within our power, and some things are not. That's it. That's the foundation. And every single thing Epictetus teaches flows from this one distinction. He argues that within our control are our judgments, our desires, our intentions, our responses. What's not in our control? Everything else. Our bodies, our reputations, other people's actions, the economy, the weather, death, all of it outside our jurisdiction. And here's where he gets sharp. Epictetus doesn't just say focus on what you can control as some nice passive suggestion. He warns that failing to make this distinction is the root of all human suffering, not some of it, all of it. Every moment of anxiety, frustration, anger, despair, he traces it back to one error, trying to control what was never yours to control. Think about that for a second. Someone insults you. You're upset for hours. Why? Epictetus would say it's not the insult that disturbed you, it's your judgment about the insult. The words left someone else's mouth. That's their business. But the moment you decided those words meant something about you, you handed your peace over, willingly. He puts it bluntly in the Discourses. It is not things that disturb us, but our judgments about things. That line has echoed through centuries. It influenced cognitive behavioral therapy, it shaped modern psychology, and Epictetus said it almost 2,000 years ago, not as theory, but as lived experience. He pushes this further. He points out that most people walk through life in a kind of slavery, not physical chains, but mental ones. They've made their happiness dependent on things they cannot guarantee: a promotion, a relationship, someone's approval. And so they live in a constant state of tension, always reacting, always at the mercy of circumstances. Epictetus calls this a misuse of the will. He argues that nature gave human beings one extraordinary power, the ability to govern their own minds. And most people never use it. They give it away, freely, to bosses, to lovers, to strangers on the street. And then they wonder why they feel powerless. But he doesn't stop at diagnosis. He prescribes a practice, a discipline. He tells his students to examine every impression that enters their mind, every emotional reaction, every flash of anger or desire, and ask one question: is this within my control or not? If it is, act with full force and full responsibility. If it's not, let it go, completely, not grudgingly, not halfway, fully release it. And this isn't cold detachment. Epictetus isn't saying don't care about anything. He's saying stop placing your well-being in the hands of things that don't answer to you. There's a difference between caring deeply and clinging desperately. He understood that difference better than most. He warns that this practice is not easy. It goes against every instinct, every social conditioning, every habit built over a lifetime. But he also insists it is the only path to genuine inner stability. Not comfort, not pleasure, stability. The kind that doesn't collapse when life shifts, because it was never built on anything life could take away. That's the core of Epictetus's philosophy. Not a technique,
not a trick, a total reorientation of where you place your sense of self. And he argues with absolute conviction that this is where freedom begins.
Epictetus presents one of his most striking metaphors in the Enchiridion. Life, he says, is a play, and you're an actor in it. But here's the part most people miss. You didn't write the script. You didn't pick the genre. You didn't even audition. The role was handed to you by God, by nature.
By fate, whatever you want to call that force, it made the casting decision, not you. And Epictetus is very specific about this. You might be given the role of a beggar. You might be given the role of a king. You might get a long part, decades on the stage, or you might get a short one, a few brief scenes, and then you're done.
He argues that none of that is yours to decide. The length of the play, the nature of the character, the circumstances written into the story, all of it sits outside your authority. So what is yours? How you play the role. That's it. That's the whole thing. Epictetus doesn't care whether you were cast as a ruler or a slave. He himself was a slave.
He knew what it meant to be handed a role no one would choose. And yet, he insists with absolute conviction that the quality of your performance is entirely within your power. A person given a small, humble role who plays it with full presence and integrity has done something greater than a person given a grand role who plays it poorly. And this is where the metaphor cuts deep, because most people spend their entire lives arguing with the casting director. They rage against the role they were given. They want a different body, a different family, a different country, a different era. They burn through years wishing the script said something else. Epictetus warns that this is the source of real misery, not the role itself, but the refusal to accept it. He's not asking for blind submission here. That's a common misread. He's asking for something far harder. He's asking you to separate what belongs to you from what doesn't, and then to pour everything you have into the part that's actually yours. Your choices, your responses, your character in the truest sense of the word. There's a tension in this idea, and Epictetus doesn't shy away from it. He acknowledges that some roles come with real suffering, poverty, illness, loss. He doesn't minimize any of it, but he holds firm. Suffering becomes unbearable, not because of the circumstances, but because of the story we tell ourselves about those circumstances.
The actor who forgets he's in a play starts to believe the stage is the whole world, and that's when things fall apart. So what does it look like to play your role well? Epictetus points to a few things.
Courage when the scene demands it, patience when the act drags on, dignity when the plot turns against you. He's not describing a performance for an audience. He's describing an internal alignment, a decision to meet whatever comes with the full force of your will and reason. The metaphor also carries a quiet reminder. Plays end. Every actor exits the stage. Epictetus treats this not as something tragic, but as something natural, built into the structure of the thing from the very beginning. Your exit was written before your entrance. Knowing that, really knowing it, changes how you move through every scene. Play your role, play it well, and when the curtain falls, walk off without clinging to the stage. That's what Epictetus asks. Nothing more, nothing less. Epictetus has this idea that sounds almost cold when you first hear it, but sit with it for a moment. It's one of the most quietly powerful things he ever said. He tells you, when you're drinking from a cup you love, remind yourself, this is a cup that can break. Not because you should be pessimistic, not because you should stop enjoying it, but because that's the truth about cups. They break. And if you forget that, you're setting yourself up for a reaction that's completely out of proportion to what actually happened. A cup shattered on the floor. That's all. But you act like the universe wronged you. Epictetus argues that this reaction, that shock, that frustration, that sense of injustice, doesn't come from the event itself. It comes from the expectation you carried. You treated a fragile thing as if it were permanent. And when reality corrected that assumption, it felt like a violation. So his fix is simple. Not easy, but simple. Acknowledge what things are before they break, before they leave, before they change. And here's where it gets heavy. He doesn't stop at cups. Epictetus extends this same logic to people. He says, when you kiss your child goodnight, whisper to yourself, tomorrow they may die. When you embrace someone you love, remind yourself that they are mortal, that they are not yours to keep. Now, that sounds brutal, almost cruel, and a lot of people push back hard against this idea. They say it's morbid, that it robs you of being present, that it poisons love with dread. But Epictetus would say the opposite. He would say you're not poisoning love, you're purifying it. Because when you fully accept that something can be taken, you stop clinging. And when you stop clinging, you actually start appreciating. He points out that most people don't grieve because they lost something. They grieve because they assumed they never would. The loss isn't the wound, the assumption is. And that's the core of the broken cup theory. It's not about detachment. It's not about becoming cold or indifferent. Epictetus isn't asking anyone to stop loving. He's asking them to stop pretending that love makes things permanent. There's a difference between holding something gently and gripping it so tight you forget it was never really yours to begin with. He warns that the tighter you grip, the more it hurts when it slips.
And it will slip. Everything does. Not because life is tragic, but because life is temporary. That's not a flaw in the design. That's the design. So what does this look like in practice?
It looks like pausing. Before you react to a loss, any loss, asking yourself, did I forget what this was? Did I treat a job like it was guaranteed? Did I treat a relationship like it was owed to me? Did I treat my health like it was some fixed feature of my existence? Epictetus argues that most suffering is just a delayed confrontation with reality. You knew the cup could break. You just chose not to think about it. And now that it's broken, you're angry. Not at the cup, not at the floor, but at the truth you refused to accept earlier. The broken cup theory, at its core, is Epictetus telling you, don't wait for things to break to remember they could. Hold them fully. Love them honestly. But never confuse what's temporary for what's permanent. That confusion, he says, is where almost all unnecessary pain begins. Epictetus doesn't tell you to cut people off. He doesn't tell you to set boundaries in the way we talk about it now. He does something far more radical. He tells you to change what those people mean to you. See, most of us walk around giving other people enormous power. Someone says something cruel, and it ruins our day. Someone disrespects us, and we carry it for weeks. Someone behaves badly toward us, and we replay the scene in our heads over and over. Epictetus looks at all of that and asks one simple question. Why did you hand them the remote control to your mind? He argues that no person, no matter how toxic, can actually reach inside you and disturb your peace. They can say words, they can act out, they can scheme and manipulate. But the disturbance you feel, that's yours. That's your judgment about what they did, not the act itself, the interpretation. And that distinction, that tiny, razor-sharp distinction, is everything in his philosophy. He puts it bluntly, it's not things that upset us, it's our opinions about things. So when someone insults you, Epictetus says the insult isn't the problem. Your belief that you've been harmed, that's the problem. And that belief, it's entirely within your control to reject. Now, does that mean he's saying toxic people don't exist? No, he's not naive. He lived as a slave. He knew cruelty firsthand. He knew exactly what people are capable of. But he draws a hard line between what someone does and how you respond. Their behavior belongs to them. Your response belongs to you. And the moment you confuse those two things, you've already lost. He warns against something specific here, the urge to retaliate. When someone wrongs you and you fire back, Epictetus argues you haven't won anything. You've actually done something worse. You've let them set the terms. You've let their character dictate yours. You became reactive. And a reactive person, in his view, is not a free person. So what does he suggest instead? He suggests you pause, not out of weakness, out of clarity. He wants you to examine the situation and ask, is this within my control? Their words? No. Their attitude? No. Their toxicity? No. Your reaction? Yes. That's the only thing on your side of the line. And he says, stay on your side. There's a passage where Epictetus makes this painfully clear. He says if someone tries to provoke you and you don't take the bait, who ends up looking foolish? Not you. The provocation only works if you accept it. If you don't, it falls flat. It returns to the person who threw it. And here's what's really striking. Epictetus doesn't frame this as patience or tolerance. He frames it as strength. The person who can stand in front of hostility and remain unmoved, that person, he argues, is more powerful than the one throwing punches, because they've mastered the one thing most people never master, themselves. He points out that we spend enormous energy trying to fix, change, or control the people around us, and almost none of that energy goes toward the one person we actually can change. That imbalance, he says, is the root of most suffering in relationships. So, no, Epictetus doesn't give you a strategy for managing toxic people. He gives you something harder. He tells you to manage yourself so thoroughly that toxic people become irrelevant, not invisible, not absent, irrelevant, because their power over you was never real. You just believed it was. Epictetus was a slave. That's not a metaphor, not a philosophical thought experiment. He was owned by another human being. And yet, this is the man who built one of the most powerful frameworks for human freedom ever articulated. That's not a coincidence. It's the whole point. See, Epictetus doesn't talk about freedom the way most people do. He's not talking about political freedom, not civil liberties, not the ability to do whatever you want, whenever you want. He argues for something far more radical than that. He argues that the only real freedom, the only kind that actually holds up under pressure, is the freedom of your own mind, your judgments, your choices, your responses. That's it. That's the territory. Everything else, your body, your reputation, your possessions, your position in society, Epictetus says none of that belongs to you. Not really. It can all be taken, seized, stripped away overnight. And if your sense of freedom depends on any of it, then you were never free to begin with. You were just comfortable, and comfort is not freedom. He draws a hard line here. There are things up to us and things not up to us. And he insists with zero hesitation that the moment you confuse the two, you become a slave. Not in chains, but in your mind. Enslaved to fear, to expectation, to the opinions of others, to outcomes you cannot control. And that's the kind of slavery most people never even recognize. Epictetus points out that a wealthy man terrified of losing his fortune is no freer than a man in shackles. A senator desperate for approval is no freer than someone locked in a cell, because both are controlled, both are reactive, both have handed over their inner authority to something outside themselves. So what does real freedom look like in his philosophy? It looks like a person who's made a decision, a deep, non-negotiable decision that nothing external will dictate their inner state, not pain, not loss, not humiliation. Epictetus doesn't say this is easy, but he says it's possible. And more than that, he says it's the only path worth walking. He warns that people spend their entire lives chasing a version of freedom that doesn't exist. They think, if I just get enough money, enough power, enough security, then I'll be free. But Epictetus calls that a trap, because the more you acquire externally, the more you have to protect. The more you have to protect, the more you have to fear. And fear is the opposite of freedom. His answer is almost disarmingly simple. Stop needing what you can't control. Not stop caring, that's not what he's saying. He's saying stop placing your sense of self, your stability, your peace in things that can be ripped away without your permission. What remains when you do that? You, your capacity to reason, your ability to choose how you respond, your power to assign meaning. That's what no emperor, no tyrant, no twist of fate can touch. And Epictetus would know. He lived it. He wasn't theorizing from a comfortable study. He forged this philosophy in actual suffering, in actual powerlessness. And he came out the other side saying, the mind that governs itself is the freest thing in existence. That's not optimism. That's not a nice idea to put on a wall. That's a man who looked at the worst of human circumstances and found something unbreakable inside it. That's what Epictetus means by freedom, and it changes everything about how you understand the word. There's a single Greek word at the heart of everything Epictetus teaches, and most people have never even heard of it: prohairesis. It doesn't translate neatly into English. Some scholars say moral choice, others say volition, others stretch it into rational faculty of choice, but none of those fully capture what Epictetus means by it. For him, prohairesis isn't just a concept, it's the foundation, the bedrock, the thing that makes a human being a human being. So what is it really? Epictetus defines prohairesis as the faculty within us that chooses, not in a casual, what should I have for dinner kind of way. He's talking about something far deeper, the capacity to decide what things mean to us, how we respond, what we assent to, what we reject. It's the inner authority that governs every judgment we make, and he argues that this, and only this, is truly ours. That distinction matters a lot, because Epictetus draws a hard line. Your body? Not yours. Your reputation? Not yours. Your possessions, your career, the opinions people hold about you? None of it. All of it can be taken, damaged, manipulated by forces outside your control. But prohairesis, he insists that no tyrant, no disaster, no chain can touch it, not without your permission. He puts it bluntly in the discourses. No one can overpower your prohairesis. They can threaten your body, they can throw you in prison, they can strip you of everything external, but they cannot reach inside and corrupt the part of you that chooses. That part remains sovereign, always. And this is where Epictetus separates himself from a lot of other thinkers. He doesn't just say you have free will. He says your will, your prohairesis, is the only thing that's free. Everything else is borrowed. Everything else is conditional. But this is unconditional. This is the one domain where you are, in his words, truly free. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Epictetus doesn't treat prohairesis as just a tool. He treats it as identity. He argues that you are your prohairesis, not your body, not your status, not your history. You are the choices you make, the inner orientation you hold toward the world. So when someone compromises their prohairesis, when they lie, when they act out of cowardice, when they chase approval at the expense of their own integrity, they aren't just making a mistake, they're losing themselves. He warns that this is the real danger in life. Not suffering, not poverty, not death. The real danger is the corruption of prohairesis, because everything external can be recovered or replaced. But once you surrender your faculty of choice, once you hand that over to fear, to pleasure, to someone else's demands, you've given away the only thing that actually belonged to you. And he's relentless about this. Throughout his teachings, Epictetus keeps coming back to one challenge: exercise your prohairesis correctly. Guard it, strengthen it. Every situation you face, every provocation, every temptation, it's all a test of this one faculty. He doesn't promise it'll be easy, but he makes the stakes clear. A person who masters their prohairesis is unbreakable. A person who neglects it is a slave, regardless of their external circumstances. So, when people reduce Stoicism to control what you can control, they're brushing past the deeper point Epictetus is making. He's not offering a life hack. He's pointing to something radical, that the seat of your freedom, your identity, your entire moral life sits inside one faculty, and it's already yours. You just have to stop giving it away. Here's something Epictetus says that stops people in their tracks. It's not the things that happen to us that cause suffering. It's our judgments about those things. That's it. That's the core of his entire philosophy right there. And most people hear that and immediately push back. Easy for you to say. But here's the thing. Epictetus wasn't some sheltered philosopher sitting in a comfortable garden. He was a slave. He lived under the absolute authority of another human being. He was physically abused. His leg was broken. Some accounts say his master deliberately crippled him. So when he says suffering is a product of the mind, not of circumstance, he's not theorizing. He's speaking from the harshest possible experience. What Epictetus argues is deceptively simple but brutally difficult to practice. Pain happens. Loss happens, disrespect happens. Those are events. But suffering is the story we attach to those events, the narrative we build, the meaning we assign. And that narrative, that's on us. He puts it bluntly in the Enchiridion. It is not things that disturb us, but our opinions about things. Not a suggestion, a diagnosis. He's saying that between every event and our emotional response, there is a gap. And in that gap lives a judgment, a choice. Most people don't even notice the gap exists. They experience something painful and immediately collapse into suffering, as if the two are the same thing. Epictetus says they're not. And he goes further. He points out that we don't just passively receive impressions from the world, we actively assent to them. Something happens, an impression forms in the mind, and then we agree with it. We say, yes, this is terrible, this is unbearable, this shouldn't have happened. That agreement, that's where suffering begins, not in the event itself, in the endorsement of the impression. So what does he want us to do? He wants us to pause, to examine the impression before we accept it, to ask, is this actually within my control? Is my judgment about this thing accurate? Or am I adding weight to something that, on its own, carries none? He warns against a very specific trap here. People confuse pain with suffering, and those are two very different things. Pain is a signal. It's physical, it's immediate, it's often unavoidable.
But suffering is a mental layer we put on top of pain. Why me? This isn't fair. I can't take this. That layer, Epictetus argues, is entirely constructed by us, and what we construct, we can also dismantle.
But, and this is important, he never says this is easy. He never claims that a person can just flip a switch and stop suffering. What he does say is that it's possible, trainable, like a muscle. Every moment of frustration, every flash of anger, every wave of grief, those are opportunities to practice the discipline of judgment, to catch the impression before it becomes a belief, to separate the event from the story. This is what makes Epictetus dangerous to complacency, because once you accept his framework, you can't blame the world anymore. Not fully. You can't point at your circumstances and say, "This is why I suffer." He strips that excuse away, not cruelly, but firmly. He doesn't promise a life without pain. He promises something harder and more honest, a life where you stop being a slave to your own reactions. And for a man who was once literally enslaved, that distinction meant everything. Suffering, in his view, is not a condition imposed on us. It's a habit we've never questioned. And the moment we question it, really question it, everything shifts. Epictetus makes a claim that, on the surface, sounds simple, but sit with it for a moment and it rearranges everything. He argues that a person's truest identity is not tied to a city, not tied to a nation, not tied to a tribe or a family name. Your deepest citizenship, he says, belongs to something far larger, the whole cosmos, the entire rational order of existence. That's your real home. And this isn't some vague poetic sentiment he throws around. He means it structurally. He's describing how reality is organized and where you actually fit inside it. See, Epictetus inherited this idea from the broader Stoic tradition. The Stoics had long spoken of a cosmopolis, a universal city of gods and human beings, bound together by shared reason. But Epictetus takes this inherited concept and sharpens it. He makes it personal. He makes it about you and how you move through the world every single day. He points out that, yes, you were born in a particular place. You belong to a particular family. You hold a particular role, a son, a daughter, a neighbor, a citizen of Athens or Rome or wherever. He doesn't deny any of that, but he insists, firmly, that none of those roles are your primary identity. They're secondary. Your first and most fundamental role? A rational being, a member of the universal community of reason. And here's where it gets heavy. Epictetus argues that once you recognize this, your obligations change. You can't just look out for your own people. You can't draw a circle around your tribe and say, "These are my people. Everyone else is a stranger." That's too small. That's beneath what you actually are. He's saying the stranger on the road and the neighbor next door, they share the same rational nature you do. They belong to the same cosmic city, and that demands something from you. Not sentimentality, duty. He warns against the kind of tribalism that shrinks a person's moral world. When someone says, "I'm an Athenian," or "I'm a Roman," Epictetus doesn't reject that, but he reframes it. He essentially says, "Fine, you're an Athenian, but before that, you're a human being, and being a human being comes with a wider set of obligations than any local citizenship ever could." So what does this look like in practice? Epictetus suggests it shows up in how you treat people who aren't yours, the foreigner, the exile, the person with no status, no connection to your world. If your cosmopolitan identity is real, and not just a nice idea you carry around, then it changes how you respond to those people. You don't dismiss them. You recognize them as fellow citizens of the same rational order. But, and this is critical, Epictetus doesn't use this idea to erase local duties. He's not saying abandon your family because you belong to the cosmos. He's layered about it. You serve your roles, father, brother, citizen of your city, but you hold all of those roles within the larger framework of your cosmic citizenship. The bigger identity doesn't cancel the smaller ones. It governs them. It provides the context. That's the discipline in it. You don't get to hide behind local loyalty to avoid universal responsibility, and you don't get to claim universal love while neglecting the person right in front of you. Epictetus holds both in tension, and he expects you to do the same. It's not comfortable. It's not meant to be. But he argues it's the truest reflection of what a rational being actually is. Someone who belongs, fully and without reservation, to the whole. Marcus Aurelius was the most powerful man in the known world, emperor of Rome, commander of legions, a man who could reshape nations with a single decree. And yet, when he sat down to write his private journal, the voice that echoed loudest wasn't his own. It was the voice of a former slave, Epictetus. That alone should tell you something. A man with unlimited external power looked to a man who had none and found him more authoritative on the subject of how to live, not because Epictetus had clever arguments, but because Epictetus had lived the philosophy in conditions that would have broken most people. He'd been enslaved. He walked with a permanent limp, possibly from abuse. He owned almost nothing. And from that position, he built a system of thought so starry that an emperor leaned on it to hold himself together. Marcus Aurelius references Epictetus throughout the Meditations, not by quoting him word for word every time, but by absorbing his ideas so deeply that they became the operating system of his inner life. The dichotomy of control, the discipline of desire, the refusal to be disturbed by things outside one's authority, these are Epictetean ideas. And Marcus didn't just admire them from a distance. He wrestled with them, nightly, in private, on the battlefield, in the palace. And here's what makes this connection so striking. Marcus Aurelius had the opposite problem of Epictetus. Epictetus had to endure powerlessness. Marcus had to endure power, endless demands. Political betrayals, wars he didn't want to fight, a plague that swept through his empire, people constantly watching, constantly needing, constantly pulling. He was surrounded by luxury and drowning in responsibility at the same time. So why Epictetus? Why not some other philosopher? Because Epictetus offered something no one else did, a framework that didn't depend on circumstances. That was the genius of it. Whether you're a slave or an emperor, the core question stays the same. What is up to you and what is not? Marcus needed that distinction more than anyone, because when you have the power to control almost everything externally, the temptation is to believe you should, and that belief will eat you alive. Epictetus gave Marcus permission to stop fighting what he couldn't change. The ingratitude of people around him, the inevitability of death, the chaos of governing an empire stretched too thin. Marcus didn't need more strategies. He needed a way of thinking that wouldn't collapse under pressure. Epictetus gave him that. There's something else too, something subtler. Epictetus didn't flatter anyone. He didn't soften his message for comfortable audiences. He challenged his students directly, sometimes harshly. He told them they were deluding themselves. He told them their suffering was self-made. He held up a mirror that most people would rather smash than look into. And Marcus, to his credit, didn't look away. He stared into that mirror every single day. You can feel it in the Meditations. Marcus isn't writing to inspire anyone. He's writing to discipline himself, to remind himself again and again of the things Epictetus taught. Don't complain. Don't claim. pretend you're owed anything. Do your work, bear your role, and when it ends, let it end.
The relationship between these two men, separated by class, by status, by everything the Roman world considered important, is one of the most powerful examples of philosophy doing what it's supposed to do. Not decorating a life, but holding one together. Marcus didn't follow Epictetus because it was fashionable. He followed him because it worked. In the hardest moments, under the heaviest weight, it held. Here's the thing about Epictetus. He lived nearly 2,000 years ago, born a slave, physically disabled, exiled. He had every reason to be bitter, resentful, broken by his circumstances, but he wasn't. And the philosophy he left behind didn't survive this long by accident. It survived because it works. Not in a vague, feel-good kind of way. It works in the trenches, in the moments when everything falls apart and you're standing in the wreckage trying to figure out what to do next. That's where Epictetus meets you. Not with comfort, with clarity. And that's exactly why he still matters. Epictetus didn't write for monks on mountaintops. He spoke to real people living real lives, people dealing with loss, with anger, with fear, with the weight of things they couldn't control. His students weren't philosophers in ivory towers. They were young men trying to figure out how to live. How to handle power, how to face death, how to stop being enslaved, not just physically, but mentally. The problems he addressed, they haven't changed, not even a little. People still lose sleep over things they can't control, still tie their self-worth to titles, possessions, approval, still react to every disruption as if the world owes them stability, still confuse comfort with freedom. Epictetus saw all of this, and he called it out, sharply, directly, without apology. He argues that the human mind, left undisciplined, will always default to blame, to complaint, to victimhood, not because people are weak, but because it's easier. It's easier to point at the world and say, this shouldn't be happening, than to look inward and say, why is this destroying me? That question, why is this destroying me, is the backbone of everything Epictetus teaches. And it's a question that hits just as hard now as it did in ancient Rome, maybe harder. Because we live in a time of constant noise, constant comparison, constant stimulation. Everyone's reacting to everything all the time. Outrage is entertainment. Opinions are identity. And the line between what actually matters and what just feels urgent has been completely blurred. Epictetus cuts through all of that. He strips life down to one ruthless distinction: what's up to you and what isn't. And he demands that you build your entire inner life around that distinction. Not once, every single day, he points out that freedom doesn't come from changing the world around you. It comes from mastering the world within you. And that idea, right there, is why his philosophy hasn't aged a day. Because no amount of technology, no amount of progress, no political revolution has ever solved the problem of a mind at war with itself. That's still your problem. That's still everyone's problem. And Epictetus doesn't just name the problem. He hands you a framework, a way of thinking that doesn't depend on your circumstances being good. It works when they're terrible. It works when you've lost everything. It works when the people around you are falling apart and you need to be the one who holds steady. That's rare. Most ideas crumble under pressure. His don't. He matters today not because he's ancient and therefore wise. He matters because what he said is still uncomfortably accurate. He looked at human nature, the way people suffer needlessly, the way they hand over their peace to things and people who never asked for it, and he described it with a precision that still lands. 2,000 years later, and we're still making the same mistakes he warned us about. That alone should tell you something.